Step into the shadows of the Seminole Swamps, 1890. Witness the capture of one of history's greatest leaders and hear tales that blur the line between fact and folklore. Which do you believe, history or legend? Comment now. Welcome to the morning the plains stopped breathing. December 15th, 1890. A morning born of ice and whispers. The Grand River slept beneath a crust of frozen glass, winding through the endless prairie like a silver scar. Snow drifted across the hills in ghostly sheets, erasing the boundaries between land and sky. There were no birds, no voices, no sound, only the slow, heavy exhale of winter itself. At the heart of that white silence stood a small circle of lodges, smoke rising weakly from their roofs, the Hunkpapa camp of Sitting Bull. Inside one of those lodges, a fire flickered and dimmed its light, painting trembling shadows on buffalo hide walls. The air smelled of sage smoke and horsehair. Around the fire offerings lay scattered eagle feathers, a drum cracked by age, the skull of a small buffalo calf. And at the center of it all sat the man the empire feared most, Tatanka Iyotake Sitting Bull. His hair had gone gray at the temples, but his eyes, black as obsidian, burned with the same quiet fire that once stared down General Custer on the Little Bighorn. His hands rested calmly on his knees, palms open to the earth. He wasn't praying, not anymore, just listening. They said he could hear things in the wind, that he spoke with the spirits of the plains, that his dreams walked before him like shadows in snow. Long ago, he dreamed of soldiers falling like leaves, their blue coats dark with blood. When the vision came true, they called him a witch, a sorcerer, a threat to peace. But to his people, he was the heartbeat of resistance, the last voice that still remembered what freedom sounded like. Outside, the stars bled into gray. The cold had teeth, and far down the frozen river, faint shapes moved. 40 Lakota policemen, men, paid by the U.S. government, sent to arrest one of their own. They rode in silence, their breath clouds in the dawn. Their rifles gleamed, faintly slung across shoulders heavy with doubt. Some had fought beside Sitting Bull years before. Some had danced the ghost dance with him only weeks earlier. Now they rode toward him, torn between duty and shame. At their head rode Bullhead, a man caught in the cruel machinery of empire, ordered to capture the only leader who ever made the empire tremble. By the time they reached the camp, the sun was still below the horizon. Horses stamped nervously, sensing what men refused to say aloud. Women stirred inside their lodges, pulling blankets tighter around children, who didn't yet know what was coming. The dogs began to bark, short, anxious bursts that broke the stillness like cracking glass. Inside his lodge, Sitting Bull's eyes opened. He had felt this moment moving toward him for days, a tide that could not be turned. He whispered something in Lakota words the wind carried away before anyone could understand. Then he reached for his pipe, lit it slowly, and took a single breath of smoke. The ember glowed red, then faded to black. The sound of footsteps came next, soft, deliberate, circling his home. A hand pulled the hide door aside. The cold rushed in. Tatanka Iyotake Bullhead called, voice shaking though he tried to steady it. "You must come with us. The agent wishes to speak with you." Sitting Bull didn't move. His gaze lifted, calm, steady, the look of a man who had already crossed into something beyond fear. "You bring many men," he said softly. "Do you fear one old man's dream?" The silence that followed was heavier than the cold. Snow drifted into the lodge, landing on the fire and hissing as it died. The smoke curled upward, blue and thin. Behind Bullhead, one of the policemen shifted his rifle. A nervous movement, a spark of iron in the half-light. Another man, Catch the Bear, stepped closer to Sitting Bull, murmuring, "Uncle, please, don't fight them. Not today." But the prophet didn't answer. He looked beyond them, through them, to something only he could see. Perhaps he saw the plains burning again. The villages scattered, the ghosts of Wounded Knee waiting on the horizon. Perhaps he saw the endless circle of time folding back upon itself. And then the wind changed. It came suddenly, fierce and dry, tearing across the camp and slamming against the lodges. Horses screamed, dogs lunged at their tethers. The policemen turned their faces from the snow. Someone shouted, "No one remembers who," and the first gun went off. The flash lit the lodge like lightning. Bullhead staggered backward, hit in the side. He fired as he fell, one reflex, one final breath of training, and his bullet found Sitting Bull's chest. The old man jerked once, his pipe falling from his fingers, ash scattering like gray snow. He sank slowly to the ground, eyes still open, fixed on something no one else could see. Outside, chaos erupted. Ghost dancers poured from their lodges, shouting, firing, screaming his name. Horses reared, men collided, rifles cracked in the frozen air. The snow turned dark beneath them. and through the smoke and confusion, someone saw it or claimed to. A shape rising from the ground, half man, half shadow, lifting into the wind and disappearing toward the west. By sunrise it was over. 14 bodies lay scattered in the snow. The river ice was stained where they fell. The soldiers would later say it was a skirmish. The newspapers called it the suppression of a fanatic. But to the Lakota, it was something else entirely. They said the old man's spirit refused to fall, that the earth itself had taken him, hidden him beneath the snow, carried him on the breath of buffalo, sent him walking into the storm. And as the day grew brighter, the wind never stopped moving. It hummed low across the plains, through the broken lodges, through the empty places where voices had once been. Some said it sounded like mourning. Others said it sounded like laughter, the kind only the dead understand. In Washington, they would call it victory. In Standing Rock, they would call it prophecy. Because that morning the Empire thought it had silenced a rebel, but what it really killed was its own chance for peace. And across the frozen river, the whisper remained drifting through the cottonwoods into the bones of the land itself. He is not gone. He has only gone to the wind. The story begins there in the silence after the last gunfire, where history ends and legend begins. And the plains still remember. The plains stretched wide and white, endless, as breath held too long. Snow blanketed everything, the ridges, the river, the broken trails where buffalo once thundered. The Grand River wound through the emptiness like a ribbon of frozen steel, each gust of wind singing a low note that seemed half prayer, half warning. Winter in Dakota did not forgive. It stripped color from the earth, silenced the birds, locked the water, and made even the strongest horses bow their heads. To the Lakota, this was not simply weather, it was a trial of spirit. The old ones said that in winters like this, the earth tested those who still remembered her songs. Yet beneath that silence, a storm of another kind was moving, one not made of snow, but of fear, hunger, and faith. After Sitting Bull fell, the camps along the Standing Rock Reservation sank into a heavy stillness. People spoke his name only in whispers. Mothers pulled their children closer at night, afraid the soldiers would come again. The young men no longer sang. The drums, once the heartbeat of the tribe, went quiet, buried under the weight of loss. The buffalo were gone. The treaties were lies. The rations were late, the flour rotten, the salt thin as dust. The Lakota were no longer warriors of the plains. They had been turned into prisoners of patience, penned inside boundaries drawn by hands that never touched the soil. In the agency records, their home was listed as Standing Rock Indian Reservation, but among themselves they called it something else, the Cage of the Living. To the north, the Missouri River rolled dark and frozen, carrying with it the faint memory of better days. Across its surface, frost crept in delicate veins, like the cracks running through the Lakota's faith. Still among them, the stories did not die. Around the fires and the low murmur of the wind, elders spoke of the ghost dance, the dance that had begun far to the west among the Paiute, and was now spreading like wildfire across every reservation. They said the prophet Wovoka had seen a vision during an eclipse. A world renewed, the white man gone, the buffalo returned, the ancestors alive, again. If you dance, he told them, if you believe the Great Spirit will bring the old world back. For people who had lost everything, that promise was more powerful than any bullet. At first the government laughed. They called it superstition, harmless, pitiful. But then the agents began to send reports. Thousands were dancing. Whole camps were chanting through the night, wearing shirts painted with sacred symbols, shirts they believed could stop bullets. By December, those reports reached Washington, and what began as mockery turned into panic. At Fort Yates, the telegraph wires hummed with urgency. Ghost dance increasing. Sitting Bull believed to be instigator. Recommend arrest before uprising spreads. They called it an uprising, though no one had fired a shot. They called it rebellion, though the Lakota only had songs. To the soldiers stationed along the Missouri, the plains no longer looked empty. Every flicker of firelight in the distance felt like a threat. Every drumbeat echoed like thunder. Fear had its own language, and it spoke fluently through the cold. Meanwhile, deep in the camps, the people prepared for something they could not name. The women patched old hides into new dresses for the ghost dance. The men carved pipes from bone-painted circles on the ground with ashes and snow. Children stood by their mothers, eyes wide, watching the rhythm of belief rise and fall like breathing. And in the middle of it all, the shadow of Sitting Bull lingered. They said he appeared in dreams standing by the river, wrapped in his buffalo robe, eyes full of light. They said the wind carried his voice when it shifted direction. Some even claimed they had seen him at the edge of the ghost dance circle, watching silently, a figure of smoke and moonlight. The agents called those rumors madness. The people called them truth. Snow kept falling. Days and nights bled into each other, white on white, silence on silence. In Washington, they drew up new orders. More troops were sent west. The 7th Cavalry, the same regiment once led by Custer. For them, this land still carried the taste of revenge. They came with machine guns, wagons of ammunition, and a hunger to prove that the frontier still belonged to them. The soldiers marched through the cold, their faces wrapped in scarves, rifles slung over their shoulders. They sang no songs. They were not heroes, just men following orders across a landscape that refused to know them. The wind cut through their coats. The cold cracked their hands. One soldier writing to his wife said, "The prairie feels haunted. Every gust sounds like a cry. The Indians watch us from the hills, though I never see them. Only their fires." And then sometimes not even that. Back at Standing Rock, the aftermath of Sitting Bull's death turned his name into myth. To the Lakota, he became more than a man, he became a sign, a warning, a promise. In the evenings, when the stars glowed hard and sharp above the plains, old women whispered prayers into the wind. Let his spirit ride the buffalo. Let him carry us home. The ghost dance grew stronger. What had been a ritual became a movement, and what had been a movement became a storm. Drums echoed through the frozen valleys. Hundreds gathered in circles singing the words Wovoka had taught them. The earth will roll up like a blanket. The white man will be gone. The old world will return. Their feet pounded the ground, steady, rhythmic, relentless, until the snow melted beneath them. Their breath rose in clouds. Their hands lifted to the sky. Their eyes filled with tears and fire. They danced through exhaustion, through hunger, through the ache of memory. Because to stop dancing would mean to accept that the world was gone forever. But belief can be as dangerous as any weapon when fear is watching. From Fort Yates to Pine Ridge, the Army's paranoia deepened. They surrounded camps, seized horses, confiscated weapons, questioned women, searched children. Every prayer looked like conspiracy. Every drumbeat sounded like war. Colonel Forsyth, commander of the 7th Cavalry, wrote in his log, "The situation is critical. The savages are preparing something." The word savage traveled fast through telegraphs, through newspapers, through the trembling imagination of the East. By Christmas, the name Ghost Dance was printed on every front page in America. And though no Lakota had raised a rifle, the country believed a rebellion had begun. The plains began to fill with soldiers, blue coats against white snow, each man carrying the fear of what he didn't understand. The Lakota saw them coming and kept dancing. By then, the circle had become a heartbeat that refused to die. They danced for Sitting Bull. They danced for the buffalo. They danced for every broken treaty, every stolen child, every promise buried beneath the frosts. And the rhythm spread across the Missouri, across the Badlands, across the bones of the dead. Some nights, the sky itself seemed to move with them. The northern lights shimmered red and green above the horizon, twisting like spirits rejoicing. The dancers said it was the sign, the veil thinning between worlds. The soldiers said it was the reflection of fires, proof that the Indians were gathering for war. The misunderstanding grew larger than either could control. As the year drew to its end, the snow fell harder. The wind screamed through the ravines like a wounded animal. And beneath it all, the sound of drums kept rising, faint at first, then stronger like the echo of 1,000 hearts refusing to surrender. The soldiers called it madness. The Lakota called it survival. Every story that winter carried two versions, one written in reports, one spoken in smoke. In the government's version, Sitting Bull was gone, peace had been restored, and the ghost dance would soon fade away. In the people's version, he had only crossed into the wind, and from the wind, he watched them dance, proud, unbroken, eternal. The plains, frozen and silent, held both truths side by side, the living and the dead, the conqueror and the conquered, the empire and its ghost. And somewhere deep within that endless white, the prophecy waited, not buried, not broken, only sleeping beneath the snow. Because history, like winter, never truly ends. It only waits for the thaw. The winter of 1890 pressed down like a living thing. The snow was no longer just weather. It was a wall between the world that had been and the world that was coming. It fell in endless waves, burying the bones of buffalo, long gone, sealing over wagon tracks, covering the footprints of a people still searching for somewhere to exist. The land lay wide and silent, a white desert of memory, and above it all, the sky burned pale and merciless. For the Lakota, the season carried an old voice, the kind that spoke through the crack of ice and the creak of trees. It said that change was coming, that the balance of the world had been broken. The elders remembered stories told by their grandfathers of a time when the land was whole and the nations were free. They remembered when the buffalo moved like thunder across the plains, when no line was drawn on a map, and the people followed the herds like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Now the buffalo were gone, and the lines on the map were iron fences, railways, forts. In the agency records, their names had become numbers. Their lands had become allotments. Their children were taken to schools where they were told to forget the words of their mothers. Each sunrise carried a little less of the old world. Yet in that long winter, something refused to die. The ghost dance had taken hold like a fever of the soul. Across the reservation, men and women gathered in circles on the frozen ground. They wore shirts painted with stars and eagles, moons and spirals, symbols of protection, of rebirth. The circles grew larger each night, spreading from Standing Rock to Pine Ridge, from Rosebud to Cheyenne River. The rhythm was steady, ancient, endless. The sound of feet striking snow became prayer, heartbeat, thunder. To outsiders, it looked like chaos, wild eyes, frantic movement, chants that carried through the night. But inside the circle, there was order. The songs followed the same pulse, the same pattern, as though guided by invisible hands. The dancers believed the movement itself opened a doorway, that if they danced long enough, the door would stay open and the world beyond would spill through. In their visions, they saw the earth made new green again, filled with buffalo. The rivers ran clear, the white man gone, the ancestors walking back from the shadows. They danced until their legs trembled, until the horizon blurred, until the snow beneath them melted from the heat of their bodies. The stars above spun slowly, as if drawn into the rhythm. The army called it rebellion. The agents called it lunacy. The newspapers called it a war dance. But for the Lakota, it was not war. It was remembrance. It was the last language left to them. Every circle carried its own story. At Pine Ridge, an old woman named Winyan Luta danced until she collapsed in the snow. When they lifted her, she whispered that she had seen Sitting Bull standing beside the buffalo, his eyes bright, his hand raised toward the rising sun. At Rosebud, a boy claimed that while he danced, the snow around him began to move like breath, and he heard voices speaking in the tongue of his ancestors. Across the plains, the tales grew not of revolt, but of revelation. The soldiers did not understand. To them, it was the same superstition they had crushed 100 times before. They read the reports from the Indian agents filled with panic, and they prepared for war. The telegraphs carried the fear faster than any horse. Within days, orders moved from Washington to Fort Yates contained the ghost dancers' arrest. Their leaders disarmed the camps. The ground froze harder with every order. At night, the soldiers lit their fires and stared into the flames, trying not to listen to the wind. Some claimed to hear drums drifting through the snow. Others saw lights moving on the horizon, small, flickering like lanterns carried by unseen hands. The men laughed about it in daylight, but in darkness they wrapped their coats tighter and whispered prayers they had forgotten since childhood. The Lakota said the spirits were walking. They said the land itself was waking up restless beneath the snow. The elders told of Wakang Thangka, the great mystery, who had turned his face away from the world, but would return when the people danced without fear. They said that Sitting Bull's death had not ended his power. It had freed it. Now his voice came in the wind, in the thunder that rolled across the plains, even when there was no storm. In Fort Yates, an officer kept a journal. One entry read, "It is as if the air itself is alive. I have never known such silence. It presses on the chest like a weight. Men wake from dreams shouting. The horses shy at nothing. The Indians stare at us like they already know how this will end." The closer the army drew, the more the stories spread. The Lakota spoke of seeing blue shadows, soldiers made of ice, walking through their camps at night, searching for something. Children woke crying, saying they had seen their ancestors outside calling them home. Women burned sweetgrass and cedar to keep the ghosts away, but the smell lingered even after the fires died. The official reports made no mention of these things. They spoke only of logistics, of numbers, of progress. But history is not only what is written, it is also what is felt. And that winter, the plains felt full of eyes. The soldiers marched south toward the Badlands. The wind carved their faces raw. Frost hung from their beards like glass. They hated the land, its emptiness, its silence, its way of swallowing men whole. They were taught to believe they were bringing order to chaos, civilization to savagery. Yet deep inside, many sensed that the savagery was their own. The land did not fight them with bullets or blades. It fought them with indifference, with vastness, with cold. Among the Lakota, prophecy turned to urgency. Bigfoot's band moved slowly following the river. The people were starving, exhausted, but they carried songs instead of weapons. They believed that the circle must not break, that every step they took was still part of the dance. Even as soldiers closed in from the north and west, they whispered to one another that Sitting Bull's spirit was leading them south, toward safety, toward the rising sun. Each night they camped beneath the same sky, and each night the northern lights shimmered above them, red and green, bending like curtains of fire. The children thought it was beautiful. The elders said it was warning. Some claimed that the lights formed the shape of buffalo, running across the heavens, a sign that the old world was trying to return. The ghost dance songs echoed through the valleys, carried by the wind. The same wind blew through the tents of the army, making their fires flicker, their flags snap like angry wings. It was as if two realities existed on the same ground, one of faith, one of fear, both moving toward the same catastrophe. In Washington, politicians debated whether the army had overreacted. None of them had ever seen the faces of the people whose names filled their reports. None of them had stood in that freezing air listening to the sound of feet against snow that could be prayer or rebellion depending on who heard it. By late December, the army surrounded the Lakota encampments. The 7th Cavalry, the ghosts of Custer's command, formed a ring of steel around a circle of song. They waited for orders, for justification, for an excuse. The officers wrote reports about disarming the hostiles. The newspapers called it restoring peace. But peace had died long before that morning. Inside the camp, the dancers kept moving. The old ones sang until their voices broke. The young men, gaunt and hollow-eyed, swayed with the rhythm until they no longer felt the cold. Mothers held infants against their chests, whispering the sacred words into small, shivering ears. The circle widened, then tightened again, breathing like a living thing. The snow fell heavier. The sky closed in. The world seemed to narrow to that one small piece of land where belief and empire faced each other, neither willing to yield. Some soldiers claimed that when they aimed their rifles, the air shimmered, that the people before them were glowing faintly, as if the snow itself was lit from within. Others saw nothing but enemies. Fear magnifies what the eyes cannot understand. The day before Wounded Knee, a scout reported hearing voices on the wind, thousands of them chanting, in a language he could not recognize. The next morning, he found the sound was gone, replaced by the hiss of falling snow. Among the Lakota, the prophecies deepened. A medicine man said that when the last of the buffalo returned, the soldiers would vanish like smoke. Another said that Sitting Bull's death had opened the doorway between worlds, and now both the living and the dead were watching. Some believed that every flake of snow was a spirit descending, that the storm itself was alive. By the final week of December, every step, every breath felt like walking on the edge of the world. The soldiers wrote their names in the frost on their rifles. The dancers painted symbols of protection on their bodies. The land held them both in the same silence. One world believed it was saving itself from chaos. The other believed it was saving the soul of the earth. Both were right in their own eyes, and that was the tragedy. That winter there were no victors, only the wind. It carried the last songs of the Lakota across the frozen plains, blending them with the rattle of chains, the whine of the telegraph, the distant hum of a nation too far away to hear what it had broken. And somewhere in that endless white, the spirit of Sitting Bull moved unseen, not as a man, not as a ghost, but as the echo of a question still unanswered. What happens when belief becomes the last weapon a people have? The snow did not answer, it only fell. The wind never stopped that winter. It scraped across the prairie like sandpaper over bone, howling through the canyons, sweeping snow into long white ribbons that shimmered in the moonlight. The soldiers on the ridges watched it move and felt small. The Lakota in the valleys listened to it and heard voices. December 1890. The plains had become a mirror of tension, reflecting fear from one side to the other. In every camp, the same questions hung like frost. Who would fire first? Who would be left to bury the dead? At Pine Ridge, Bigfoot's people kept moving south, slow and desperate. The old chief's fever worsened. He coughed blood onto the snow, but refused to stop. Each night, he ordered the people to gather to pray, to sing the ghost dance one last time before sleep. They circled under a sky that flickered with aurora light, the cold biting through bare feet, the stars so close they seemed to burn holes in the dark. Mothers held children who had forgotten warmth. Men watched the horizon knowing soldiers were near. The army followed their trail, dark smudges of smoke on the horizon, the faint imprint of moccasins, the tracks of ponies half-starved. Colonel Forsyth's orders were clear: intercept, disarm, escort, but fear distorted clarity. Reports of hostiles multiplied. Scouts whispered of hundreds, perhaps thousands gathering for a final strike. Each rumor traveled faster than the truth, and each rumor demanded an answer written in steel. The closer the soldiers came, the more the land seemed to turn against them. Snow blinded the columns, horses slipped on hidden ice, compass needles spun erratically. A private swore he heard drums under the ground as if the earth itself were keeping time. Another claimed he saw footprints in the snow that filled themselves in as he watched. The officers laughed at superstition, yet every man slept with his rifle near his face. On December 28th, the scouts sighted smoke along Wounded Knee Creek. Bigfoot's band had stopped exhaustion, had forced the halt. The soldiers approached under a sky the color of pewter, the sun weak, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and sickness. The Lakota stood silently as the cavalry rode in. They did not resist. They were surrounded before anyone spoke. Forsyth ordered them to make camp near the creek. Guards formed a ring around the teepees. The soldiers pitched their own tents in a wider circle. The barrels of their Hotchkiss guns pointed inward. Between the two circles, the wind howled through the frozen grass. Night fell early. The cold sharpened. The sound of coughing carried from the Lakota camp, rough, hollow, endless. From the hills, the landscape looked peaceful, small fires glowing in the dark. A few moving shadows, the white river curling like glass. But inside the camp, tension coiled tight. The people whispered of Sitting Bull's spirit walking the river that night. They said his shadow passed over the snow without leaving a mark. Old women tied red cloth to the poles of their lodges to keep the restless dead away. Men sang low songs to steady their hearts. Children huddled near the fires, tracing patterns in the frost, with their fingers circles, always circles. Across the frozen creek, soldiers wrote letters home. One described the Lakota as strangely calm, like they know what's coming. Another admitted he could not shake the feeling that someone was watching him, even when he stood alone. In the stillness, every sound was magnified, the creak of leather, the pop of wood in the fire, the distant cry of a coyote that sounded almost human. At dawn the next day, the world turned white and silent again. Frost coated the rifles, the horses' manes, the eyelashes of every man and woman. A bugle sounded brittle and flat. The soldiers began to move. Forsyth rode into the Lakota camp with an interpreter and a handful of troopers. He told Bigfoot they must surrender their weapons. The chief, wrapped in blankets, could barely lift his head. He nodded weakly. The people began to bring out rifles, a few old muskets, even toys mistaken for guns. Piles of steel and wood grew in the snow. Some soldiers laughed at the crude weapons. Others grew nervous at how many appeared. Then came a young man, Black Coyote, deaf, proud, angry. He refused to give up his rifle. The others shouted for him to stop to listen, but the wind swallowed the words. A soldier grabbed the barrel. The rifle went off. The shot cracked through the cold like the sky splitting open. For one heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the world exploded. The soldiers fired into the crowd. The Hotchkiss guns on the hill began to thunder shells, tearing through canvas, through bodies, through snow. Women screamed. Children ran. The air filled with smoke and blood and snowflakes falling like ashes. Men who had been praying seconds earlier threw themselves against the soldiers, trying to protect their families. Horses screamed and broke their tethers, charging blindly into the line of fire. From the hills above, it looked like chaos. From inside the camp, it was the end of the world. The Lakota who survived the first volley fled into the ravine by the creek. The soldiers turned the guns to follow. Bullets chewed through snow, through flesh, through silence. When it was over, the ravine was filled with bodies tangled in ice and crimson water. In less than an hour, 300 Lakota lay dead, half of them women and children. 25 soldiers were killed, many by their own crossfire. The snow turned red, then brown, then froze. By midday, the wind picked up again. It blew across the battlefield, lifting the hair of the dead, scattering feathers, erasing footprints. The soldiers walked among the fallen, collecting rifles, jewelry, anything of value. Some spoke softly, others cursed, some prayed. One officer later wrote, "It was not a battle, it was a slaughter, and we all knew it." The survivors, a few wounded, a few uninjured, stumbled across the prairie following the river south. The temperature dropped below zero. They carried nothing. The bodies they left behind froze where they fell, arms outstretched toward the sky. When the army photographers arrived days later, they found the scene unchanged, corpses stiff, under a skin of snow, the creek half covered with ice. They arranged the bodies for the camera, made notes, counted, named. The official report called it a regrettable necessity. The newspapers called it victory. But the wind carried a different story. The Lakota who returned to the site years later said they could still hear the drums under the earth. When the wind blew from the north, the sound rose faint but steady, the rhythm of the ghost dance continuing beneath the frozen ground. They said, Sitting Bull's prophecy had been fulfilled. The white man had indeed destroyed himself through his own fear. That winter, the plains became a graveyard. The army withdrew to its forts. The snow kept falling, erasing the paths of the living and the dead alike. At night, the northern lights returned red-green, flickering over the horizon, like the reflection of unseen fires. Travelers passing through claimed to see shapes moving among the lights, figures in motion, spinning slowly as if dancing. Some called them ghosts. Others said they were reminders. In Washington, medals were minted. In the Dakotas, the people buried their songs. Yet every gust of wind across the prairie still carried fragments of words no rifle could silence. They spoke of the river, the snow, the circle that would never close. And beyond the edge of hearing where the land meets the sky, the voice of Sitting Bull lingered, not in anger, not in surrender, but in promise. The empire had written its history in blood. The wind would rewrite it in memory. The plains were cold enough to make the very air brittle. Snow lay deep and unbroken, stretching to the horizon in endless white that reflected the pale winter sun like a sheet of glass. The wind scoured the ridges, whipping through the sparse trees and grass, carrying with it the sharp scent of frost and frozen river. Across this vast frozen landscape, the survivors of Wounded Knee moved southward, their faces etched with exhaustion, grief, and a stubborn will to survive. Every step pressed deep into snow, hardened by wind and ice, leaving footprints that would be erased almost as soon as they were made, swallowed by the relentless prairie. The band was small now, scattered by the chaos of the massacre. Mothers clutched children close, their blankets torn and wet faces pale from cold. Fathers leaned on each other for support. Rifles clutched tightly, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. The horses were thin, shivering ears twitching at every sound, hooves crunching on ice and frozen soil. Each member of the band carried not just the physical weight of survival, but the psychic weight of witnessing death chaos and the betrayal of what little protection they had left in the world of the living. At night, the survivors huddled behind drifts, gathering what little firewood they could find. Smoke from small fires rose thinly against the black sky, curling toward stars that burned so brightly they seemed almost tangible, distant beacons for those who had lost their bearings. Around these fires, elders told stories of Sitting Bull, of his presence among the living, and the dead, of his guidance in the hours of need. They whispered that his spirit moved through the snow, invisible yet tangible, guiding the weary southward, protecting them with a power that soldiers could neither see nor comprehend. Children listened wide-eyed, learning that their world was more than flesh and steel, more than rifles and bullets, that it was also spirit and memory, wind and snow. The ghost dance had not ended, it had transformed. The dance became a compass, a shield, and a source of hope. Those who could dance did, even in the freezing cold. The rhythm of stomping feet against snow, the songs sung into the night created a pulse that seemed to bind the survivors together, binding them to the land and to their ancestors. Medicine men carried sacred pipes, sending smoke into the air that mingled with frost, rising in pale spirals that were said to carry prayers to the Great Spirit. Women and children moved in time with the dancers singing, chanting, and repeating prayers taught for generations. The elders interpreted every gust of wind, every shifting drift, every shimmer of northern lights as signs from Sitting Bull, guiding the movement of the group, warning them and protecting them from dangers unseen. The army trailing them faced the opposite reality. Soldiers moved through the snow with rifles ready, yet their progress was slowed by frostbite-exhausted horses and terrain that was almost incomprehensible. Drifts concealed the paths of the Lakota streams that appeared frozen broke unexpectedly, and even familiar ridges became disorienting in the whiteout. Scouts reported movement often misinterpreted as deliberate tactics, and the officers grew increasingly anxious. Every sound in the wind, a howl, a snap, a distant drumbeat, was exaggerated into the threat of ambush. Orders were sent to tighten the perimeter, to press forward, to bring the fugitives under control. Each telegram carried the weight of panic, misunderstanding, and fear amplified by distance. Within the band, the survivors maintained extraordinary discipline despite fatigue. Every night, small groups would break off to find firewood, to scout the path ahead, to care for the sick or wounded. Paths were chosen carefully, guided by both memory and what elders described as spiritual intuition. Children were carried across thin ice. Elders were lifted over obstacles. When soldiers approached, the movement of the band was calculated to confuse, to evade, to survive. Snow and wind conspired with them, covering tracks, muffling sounds, creating the illusion that they vanished into the plains themselves. These acts were seen by the Lakota as part of Sitting Bull's ongoing guidance manifestations of his spirit in the land, protecting them from the violence still threatening to close in. Stories and folklore became inseparable from the facts of survival. Survivors told of visions in the frost-laden nights, Sitting Bull riding a pale buffalo across the horizon, raising his hand toward the south, signaling which paths were safe. Others claimed to see shimmering figures, transparent and glowing in the snow, moving ahead of them, guiding them through blizzards. Every unusual sound, every shifted snowdrift, every crackling branch was interpreted as communication, as an omen, as a layer of protective magic. To outsiders, these were delusions. To the people themselves, they were proof that the ancestors and the fallen prophets still walked beside them. The physical hardships were relentless. Frostbite gnawed at extremities, exhaustion sapped strength, hunger left bellies hollow. Children stumbled repeatedly, forcing parents to carry them across treacherous terrain. Yet each person pressed on, bolstered by spiritual belief and the collective will to survive. The cold and the blizzards became another participant in the story. Sometimes a foe, sometimes a shield, sometimes a messenger of the spirit's will. Soldiers attempting to intercept them were frequently misled, misstepping across hidden ice, sliding down unseen ravines, and losing direction in the white nothingness that covered the land. Each encounter with the army heightened tension exponentially. Soldiers spread across ridges, their guns trained on invisible targets, miscalculating distances, misreading signals. A child darting across a drift could trigger panic. Horses bolted at imagined threats, breaking formations. Reports of unseen hostiles multiplied. From their perspective, the Lakota were everywhere and nowhere, a wave of spirits moving across the snow impervious to bullets. Every step, every stumble, every snow-covered footpath became a psychological battlefield, as much as a physical one. Amid these trials, the band's cohesion was remarkable. Elders instructed the young, in the sacred songs in the proper way, to step in rhythm in the words that invoked protection. Every act of ritual reinforced survival. Even the most desperate moments, freezing nights, scarce food, wounded members were filled with small ceremonies, blessings, prayers, and invocations. These rituals transformed despair into purpose. The landscape, though harsh and punishing, became a partner, a carrier of memory and belief, guiding the movement southward. As days passed, the survivors neared Pine Ridge. Every step brought them closer to relative safety, yet the tension never diminished. The soldiers pressed forward, driven by orders and fear. Snowstorms obscured vision, and the plains themselves became a labyrinth. Each twist of the river, each ridge, each hill became both a potential trap and a marker of hope. The survivors' knowledge of the terrain, combined with the guidance they felt from Sitting Bull's spirit, allowed them to move with precision that baffled their pursuers. The psychological interplay between the spiritual, babais, and the physical became central. Soldiers saw shadows, misread snowdrifts, felt the wind move in unnatural ways. The Lakota saw signs, interpreted omens, and made decisions that preserved life in ways conventional military strategy could not predict. The land, the wind, the ice, the snow, everything was alive and in motion, responding to the movement of a people who had learned to read it for generations. At night, under auroras painted red and green, the people rested minimally, listening to the wind for guidance, repeating chants, keeping the circle alive. They moved again at first light, their discipline and belief carrying them over frozen streams, ridges, and snow-laden plains. The journey became both a physical flight and a spiritual passage. Every fall, every slip, every breath of cold air reminded them of fragility, but also of resilience. The snow-covered land retained every trace of movement: footprints, broken branches, remnants of fires, faint smoke. These were records of passage, yet the most enduring marks were invisible: the stories, the prayers, the songs, the visions of Sitting Bull guiding them, the ghost dance continuing in spirit, even when the circle was no longer physically possible. These traces created a narrative layer that no military report could erase, a blend of fact and folklore that endured far beyond the immediate events. By the time the survivors reached the vicinity of Pine Ridge, the majority of the band had endured days of relentless cold, hunger, and fear. Their bodies were weakened, their spirits strained, yet their cohesion, faith, and knowledge of the land allowed them to endure. The ghost dance remained no longer simply a ritual, but a living continuum of memory, prophecy, and resistance. The spirit of Sitting Bull, the ancestors and the ancestors' connection to the land had carried them through the most perilous stretch of their journey. And even as they reached this relative safety, the tension remained. Every shadow on the snow could be a soldier, every gust of wind a message from the unseen. Yet the survivors pressed forward, understanding that survival was not merely a matter of escaping bullets, but of maintaining belief, cultural continuity, and connection to the spiritual framework that had guided them from the beginning. Fact and folklore, physical danger and spiritual guidance, historical record and ancestral memory all existed simultaneously, forming the layers of experience that defined their winter journey across the plains. The wind tore across the plains like a living blade, carrying with it the smell of frost smoke and blood. The ground was hard, frozen, brittle underfoot, yet it was alive with memory, each ridge and hollow, every bend of the Grand River, marked by footsteps, both living and spectral. Survivors moved with the precision of the desperate and the haunted, pressed onward by hunger, by frostbite, and by the unyielding pulse of hope. Children clutched their mothers, women wrapped in layers of buffalo hide, their eyes hollow but unbroken, while men carried rifles as much for protection as for the weight of tradition, of responsibility, of defiance. Every exhale formed clouds that hung suspended in the air, each breath a testament to survival in a world that sought to erase them. The army followed. Soldiers moved through the snow like shadows, disciplined, tense eyes, scanning every drift, every ridge. They expected ambush, rebellion, a last desperate charge. But the Lakota offered no such spectacles. They moved quietly, spiritually, guided by ancestral knowledge and by the unseen presence of Sitting Bull. The soldiers could not perceive, it could not read it, and in this gap of understanding, panic began to spread among the ranks. Reports back to Fort Yates were filled with confusion. Movements, inexplicable paths untraceable, enemy possibly multiplied by illusions or snow. The survivors crossed frozen rivers, scaled ridges that were nothing but ice and wind, and at each point the environment conspired for them. Snow drifted to obscure footprints, winds carried sound away from pursuers, and ice created hazards that slowed the cavalry. Yet in this deadly landscape, the ghost dance continued. Men and women still raised their voices to the sky, stamping their feet in circles, chanting words older than any map, older than any order from Washington. The rhythm was the heartbeat of survival, a pulse that connected the living, the dead, and the yet to come. The aurora borealis flared in the night sky, red and green, twisting like serpents across the horizon. The dancers claimed these were signs, Sitting Bull's spirit riding alongside them, marking safe paths, warning of danger. Children gazed upward, shivering, believing they could see his figure in the glow guiding their steps, watching over them as they moved through the labyrinth of winter. Elders whispered prayers, blessing each footfall, each snow-covered trail, and each fragile life carried forward. The soldiers encountered the band as it approached the Badlands. Orders were explicit: prevent escape, disarm the survivors, enforce control. Yet terrain and weather worked against them. Horses slipped on ice, frozen rivers cracked under weight, snow obscured visibility to mere feet. Scouts reported shadows where none should have existed, tracks that vanished under the next gust, and sounds, drums chanting that seemed to echo from nowhere. The army began to move cautiously, formation breaking and reforming, with every misstep confusion growing as the elements themselves seemed to conspire with the hunted. The Lakota relied on both experience and spiritual guidance. Paths were chosen to avoid direct confrontation, rivers crossed where ice was thickest, ridges scaled to maximize cover. Every landmark carried memory, the bend in the river where buffalo once drank the hollow, where ancestors had hidden during raids the crest from which signals could be sent. The spiritual dimension was as real as the physical. Sitting Bull's guidance manifested in visions of safe routes, in whispers on the wind, in patterns of drifting snow that seemed to mark where the army could not follow. Tension mounted to a breaking point. At the edge of the Pine Ridge encampment, scouts reported columns of soldiers advancing from multiple directions. The survivors formed smaller groups, moving swiftly, slipping between ridges and frozen gullies. Women carried infants and supplies. Men formed rearguard actions to confuse pursuers. The wind carried the sound of horses of boots, crunching ice of rifles being readied. Every movement, every sound was amplified, every misstep potentially fatal. The landscape itself became an ally and an obstacle, its frozen gullies, ice sheets, and hidden ravines reshaping the battlefield in real time. Night fell, but there was no rest. Fires were lit briefly, to prepare meals and to melt ice for water. then extinguished, leaving only the glow of distant stars to guide movement. The aurora flared again, brighter, more intense, and the survivors interpreted its flickers as the presence of ancestors, a sign to continue to endure, to maintain cohesion. Children were lifted by elders across treacherous ice feet, numb and frozen, yet spirits fueled by belief. The songs of the ghost dance echoed softly as they moved, carried by the wind over ridges bouncing against hills, embedding themselves into memory, becoming as tangible as the snow beneath their feet. The soldiers advanced cautiously, aware of the dangers of blizzards and hidden terrain. Men slipped, guns misfired, and small miscalculations threatened to unravel formations. The frozen land, the whiteness and the unseen movements of the Lakota created illusions that magnified the survivors' numbers. Officers debated whether they were facing an overwhelming force, their fear heightened by every ghostly shadow, every drift of snow shaped by wind into forms that suggested figures where none existed. The environment became an extension of the Lakota will. The plains, rivers, and ice were allies in the struggle, each ridge and hollow a mechanism of survival. The climax approached on the eve of their arrival near the river valleys beyond Pine Ridge. Snow fell heavily, wind howled, and visibility dropped to near zero. Each step was deliberate, every moment required vigilance. The survivors navigated frozen streams and high ridges, leaning on each other, guided by both the land and the perceived presence of Sitting Bull. Some claimed that he appeared in visions on the ridges ahead, silent but commanding, his robes flaring like ghostly banners in the wind. The spiritual and physical realms merged, creating a rhythm of survival that defied logic. As dawn approached, the survivors faced a final challenge, a deep ice-covered ravine that the army had predicted would be their trap. The Lakota moved slowly, testing the ice using poles to gauge depth, carrying children and supplies with careful precision. The soldiers approached from above, expecting confrontation, but the survivors had already anticipated the angles, the timing, and the hazards. Small groups slipped across fissures in the ice unnoticed, guided by signs the army could not perceive, guided by visions by the wind, by the ancestors. In the final hours, every element conspired to heighten the intensity. Snow shifted, ice cracked underfoot, animals startled and bolted, sending messages across the plains. Shadows moved where no one should be. Voices carried across gullies, and the cadence of the ghost dance persisted invisibly among the surviving bands. To the soldiers, the world seemed uncanny, ungovernable. To the survivors, it was their terrain, their protection, and their proving ground. By the time the sun fully rose, painting the snow in cold gold, the band had reached a plateau overlooking a river valley. Exhaustion had racked bodies, frostbite had numbed limbs, and hunger gnawed at bellies. Yet the cohesion remained. The dance continued in spirit, and the faith persisted. The army could advance no further without risking itself in the treacherous terrain. The climax was not a battle fought with rifles alone, but a culmination of endurance, belief, and ancestral guidance, the convergence of human will, spirit, and the merciless environment of the northern plains. In this moment, the plains themselves bore witness. Every ridge, every drift, every frozen river became a record of endurance. Footprints and animal tracks interlaced with patterns of ritual and movement. Fires extinguished or smoldering cast long shadows that merged with the spirits of those fallen. The survivors, weary, yet resolute, pressed onward, guided by the presence of Sitting Bull, the ancestors, and the unbroken pulse of the ghost dance. The climax had not been a single explosive event, but a sustained, tense, and intricate dance between life and death, reality and spirit, flesh and faith. And as the survivors moved beyond the immediate reach of the army, the plains held a profound silence. The snow-covered land seemed to breathe the wind, carrying faint echoes of drums' chants and the voice of Sitting Bull. The climax of their winter ordeal had been reached, yet its echoes would persist indefinitely in the memories of the survivors, in the legends of the Lakota, in the frozen earth that had witnessed both violence and the unyielding resilience of a people whose spirit refused to be crushed. The snow began to settle once more, heavier now, blanketing the plains with a cold, almost reverent silence. The wind carried whispers of the events that had unfolded, murmurs that slipped through the ridges and gullies, winding around frozen riverbeds and through the skeletal remains of burned lodges. Where once the soldiers had marched with certainty, there was now only emptiness, punctuated by the distant cry of a lone coyote and the occasional gust that rattled the branches of cottonwoods. The plains themselves seemed to mourn, recording every step, every fall, every heartbeat in ice and memory. The survivors moved slowly southward, their progress measured, each step deliberate. Exhaustion weighed on their bodies. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, and yet they pressed on. Every movement carried both grief and resolve. Mothers clutched children who had seen horrors they could not understand. Fathers bore rifles as much to remember the fallen as to guard against imagined threats. The wounded were lifted and carried across ice and snow, while those capable of walking leaned on each other for support. Each breath was a struggle, each heartbeat a testament to endurance, each footfall an act of defiance. The ghost dance continued, though altered now, transformed from a ritual of preparation into a ritual of remembrance and survival. Dancers moved silently in the shadows, sometimes barefoot, sometimes with threadbare moccasins tracing circles in snow, so deep that their patterns were obliterated within minutes. Medicine men carried their sacred pipes, the smoke curling into the pale light of dawn, mingling with frost and carrying prayers to the Great Spirit. They whispered that Sitting Bull's spirit remained among them, guiding each step, ensuring that the cycle of life, death, and memory persisted despite the slaughter that had cut through their ranks. From the hills above, the survivors could see the remnants of the camps they had left behind. The snow had begun to conceal footprints, blankets, and the bodies of those who had fallen. In some places, the wind had swept the snow in drifts so deep that only the highest ridges remained visible. Yet, even in this desolation, the people carried a kind of clarity. They understood that their journey was not merely a flight from soldiers, but a passage through the consequences of history, through the raw and unalterable truths of what had happened, and through the ongoing presence of the spiritual forces they believed guided them. The soldiers withdrawn to Fort Yates and other posts cataloged the aftermath with meticulous coldness. Reports recorded numbers, supplies, injuries, and hostile resistance, but the pages could not capture the rhythm of grief, the invisible presence of ancestors, the stories whispered from the edge of the trees to those who survived. To the bureaucrats, the events were history written in ink. To the Lakota, they were a living narrative carried in breath movement song and the very snow underfoot. The survivors reached Pine Ridge, where some semblance of safety awaited, though the landscape itself was unforgiving. Fires were lit small and careful to warm bodies and prepare simple meals. Children, pale and trembling, were wrapped in blankets and comforted by the elders. Men and women tended to the wounded, applying snow as compress water thawed from ice and herbs as medicine. Each act of care was both practical and ceremonial, honoring the spirits of those who had fallen and acknowledging the presence of Sitting Bull as a continuing guide. The psychological aftermath was layered with complexity. Every survivor carried the trauma of witnessing indiscriminate death, of fleeing under fire, of enduring freezing conditions without relief. Every song, every prayer, every dance was an assertion of continuity, an insistence that the past, though violent, had not fully claimed the future. Elders told stories of ancestors appearing in dreams of figures moving through the snow of Sitting Bull's shadow, passing silently over the ridges, reinforcing the sacred connection between the living and the dead. Stories began to spread beyond the immediate survivors. Traveling messengers and displaced families recounted the events to other bands, to children who had not yet been born during the massacre, to people who had only heard of Sitting Bull through rumor. The ghost dance, now inseparable from the collective memory of violence and survival, became a symbol not only of prophecy but of cultural resilience. It transformed the trauma of Wounded Knee and other events into a continuum of spiritual and historical memory, a lens through which the Lakota interpreted the world. The physical landscape bore the evidence of the events, but the spiritual and cultural landscape bore more. The snow hid footprints, but not stories. River ice concealed fallen bodies, but could not erase songs. Hollowed ridges recorded chants and echoes, and the wind carried voices and forms that could only be heard by those attuned to the ancestral language of the plains. Each element, snow, wind, ice, river, was read as a message, a map, a sign of guidance. Fact and folklore were intertwined, inseparable, each amplifying the other in the memory and consciousness of the survivors. Weeks later, as the snow slowly began to soften, the survivors reflected on what they had endured. Families mourned openly, naming the dead, marking graves with stones and prayers. Men and women spoke of visions of ghosts appearing in the frost of the guidance that had allowed them to survive when logic and numbers suggested certain defeat. Children, some only months old during the events, were taught to remember the names, the rituals, the movements, the sacred dances that had protected them. Even as external forces attempted to erase or rewrite the history of these events, the survivors' memory, fortified by ritual and oral tradition, resisted erasure. The plains retain the marks of the winter-flattened drifts, cracked ice-broken branches, the occasional artifact preserved in frozen soil. To soldiers, these were minor details in a military report. To the Lakota, each was a symbol, a talisman, a reminder that the earth itself was an ally, that the spirits were real, and that Sitting Bull's vision continued to guide the people beyond death and violence. Each ridge, each hollow, each bend of the river held significance, forming a layered archive where history, memory, and spiritual presence coexisted. The soldiers returned to posts carrying reports, medals, and the memory of orders executed. They assumed control over the region, yet the events had left an indelible mark. Panic, fear, and misunderstanding had ensured that even as bodies were counted and property seized, the Lakota remained unbroken in spirit. The land itself, harsh and unyielding, had provided shelter and guidance. The memory of Sitting Bull and the ghost dance persisted, forming the backbone of a cultural and spiritual continuity that no rifle or blizzard could destroy. In the years following, the survivors told their stories to those who would listen. Every retelling was both literal and symbolic, preserving historical fact and spiritual truth. Children were instructed in the dances and the songs, in the prayers, and in the understanding that the land itself held memory. Elders reminded them that Sitting Bull's spirit continued to move with the wind, to appear in visions to guide them through paths known and unknown. Fact and folklore existed side by side, inseparable, forming a tapestry of survival, defiance, and remembrance. Even today, the snow-covered plains of Dakota hold echoes of that winter. Stories of the ghost dance, of Sitting Bull's spirit of the winter, marches, the flight, and the massacre are passed down through generations. Historians document the events with dates, numbers, and reports. Elders pass the same stories as living memory, woven into the land carried by wind, river, and ridge. The two layers, recorded fact and spiritual memory, coexist, each enriching the other, ensuring that the past remains present, visible, not only in records but in breath, in dance, in the whispered prayers of descendants. And so, the narrative concludes yet persists. The winter of 1890 ended, but its memory did not. The survivors settled, healed, taught the young, and preserved the ghost dance in modified forms. Sitting Bull's legacy endured not just in physical remembrance, but as a living force, a guiding presence, a spiritual framework through which the Lakota understood the relationship between the living, the dead, and the land. History, folklore, survival, and prophecy had fused into a continuum, one that would resonate across generations, reminding all who listened that even in the face of violence and oppression, belief, courage, and memory endure. The plains exhaled their frozen breath. Snowflakes swirled around the ridgetops. The river flowed silently beneath ice that had witnessed everything. And somewhere in that wind across the ridges and valleys, the voice of Sitting Bull lingered, steadfast, eternal, and unbroken, a whisper through history that said, "We endure. The circle remains unbroken." Sitting Bull's capture may be history, but the spirits of the swamp tell a different story. Do you believe in what happened beyond the official records? Share your thoughts below and keep the discussion alive.